cinematic, ultra-realistic wide shot, showing the same man aged 35 to 40, in the same outfit walking slowly around the same massive hollow tree trunk, checking cleanliness from every side. The forest floor is now cleared and organized. Dense jungle background, morning light rays, and light fog remain identical. Full fast motion, continuous cinematic camera glide, full realism. When we observe someone walking in later life, we often see reassurance in a rhythm. Foot meets ground, body shifts forward, breath settles in a cadence. And there is genuine value in that repetition, because walking sustains circulation, preserves joint lubrication, and keeps metabolic processes engaged. Yet if we look deeper into the cellular choreography unfolding beneath the surface, we begin to notice something subtler taking place, something quieter, something that challenges our assumptions about sufficiency. The human body adapts specifically to the demands placed upon it, and this principle does not disappear with age. If anything, it becomes more decisive, more selective, more insistent on meaningful stimulus. Walking provides predictability, and predictability is biologically economical, but economy is not growth, and tissues that are not invited into effort gradually renegotiate their participation in movement. Inside skeletal muscle, there exist fibers that once responded eagerly to strain and resistance, fibers that interpret tension as instruction, and over decades these fibers diminish in size and responsiveness when not regularly recruited, not because they fail, but because they obey the logic of conservation. And when walking becomes the sole form of activity, the demand placed upon those fibers rarely surpasses thresholds required to remind them of their potential. The nervous system also listens carefully to repetition, refining pathways that are frequently used while allowing others to fade into background silence, and thus walking alone reinforces stability and forward motion, yet offers limited conversation with lateral balance, controlled descent, or rotational coordination, movements that often determine whether a person maintains independence or experiences vulnerability. Bone itself, often imagined as static scaffolding, is remarkably perceptive, constantly sensing mechanical forces through microscopic strain detectors embedded in its matrix, and when it encounters varied loading patterns it responds by reinforcing density where needed, redistributing mineral resources in subtle architectural redesigns, yet uniform, gentle loading signals little urgency, and the skeleton responds accordingly with minimal structural investment. After 75, when mineral retention naturally competes with metabolic shifts, the absence of varied stimulus can mean the difference between resilience and fragility, between confidence and hesitation in daily action. And here we begin to appreciate that walking, though honorable, cannot alone deliver the multidimensional signals that bone, muscle, and connective tissue interpret as reason to remain robust. There is also the matter of joint ecology, a term I like to use when describing the environment in which cartilage, synovial fluid, and ligaments interact. Because joints thrive not merely on motion but on diversified motion, patterns that compress and release surfaces from changing angles, encouraging nourishment to circulate through tissues that lack direct blood supply, and monotony in movement restricts that exchange, quietly narrowing the spectrum of adaptation. When targeted loading, even gentle, measured loading, is introduced, something remarkable unfolds. Dormant communication channels awaken, proprioceptive receptors amplify their awareness of position, stability strategies refine themselves, and the individual begins not simply to move but to sense movement again. This awakening is neither dramatic nor theatrical. It occurs through incremental invitations extended to the body, perhaps through controlled rises from a chair, deliberate engagement of the posterior chain, or mindful shifts in weight that challenge equilibrium. And what fascinates me scientifically is how rapidly physiology responds to such invitations even in advanced years, demonstrating that plasticity does not vanish but merely awaits instruction. Muscle protein synthesis can be stimulated, neural recruitment patterns reorganized, and metabolic efficiency recalibrated, illustrating that aging systems remain responsive participants rather than passive observers. Philosophically, this understanding invites compassion toward ourselves, because many individuals equate aging with irreversible surrender, when in truth it often reflects a negotiation shaped by environmental dialogue, and movement choice becomes language, a vocabulary through which we tell the body what we expect of it. And when we speak only in monotone repetition, the response echoes monotony, yet when variation enters, curiosity enters, and with curiosity emerges potential. There is dignity in recognizing that effort need not be extreme to be meaningful. Precision, intention, and attentiveness transform modest actions into biological messages that resonate deeply within cellular networks. Imagine standing not as a passive traveler moving through space, but as an architect subtly redesigning structural integrity with each purposeful motion, realizing that the threshold between maintenance and enhancement is often defined by awareness rather than intensity, and that the body, even after decades of service, listens attentively to nuanced signals, translating them into microscopic adjustments that collectively shape macroscopic capability. Walking remains beautiful and necessary, but it is only one dialect in a language far richer than we often acknowledge. And by expanding that dialogue through deliberate muscular engagement and skeletal persuasion, we invite physiology to remember possibilities it once expressed effortlessly, reminding ourselves that adaptation is not reserved for youth, but is instead a lifelong conversation unfolding quietly beneath consciousness. There is a remarkable silence in the way the nervous system preserves balance, a silence that hides an intricate orchestra of signals traveling faster than conscious thought, constantly measuring position, predicting motion, and negotiating with gravity so that the body may remain upright without deliberate calculation. When we speak about movement in later life, particularly beyond 75, we often focus on muscles, as if they alone bear responsibility for stability. Yet muscles are only instruments responding to a conductor that resides within neural circuitry. Walking, with its familiar rhythm and predictable forward progression, sustains certain neural pathways, yet it rarely challenges the communication networks responsible for rapid adaptation, directional change, or unexpected shifts, and thus the brain gradually reduces investment in pathways that are not repeatedly invited into action. Inside the inner ear, tiny structures filled with fluid detect acceleration and orientation, while receptors embedded in muscles and joints continuously inform the brain about stretch, pressure, and spatial alignment, and together they form a dynamic sensory map that allows equilibrium to feel effortless. Over time, however, sensory acuity can soften when stimulation becomes narrow, not as a failure, but as a recalibration toward efficiency, because the nervous system is economical, favoring signals that appear most relevant for survival within its perceived environment. When walking is a dominant activity, the environment appears stable and predictable, and so neural emphasis narrows toward maintaining forward rhythm rather than cultivating multidirectional responsiveness. The consequence is subtle yet meaningful. Reaction time lengthens, micro-adjustments lose sharpness, and the body's capacity to recover from perturbation diminishes. And this shift rarely announces itself dramatically, instead revealing itself in moments of hesitation, in cautious foot placement, or in the unconscious preference for handrails and supports. From a scientific perspective, this illustrates a principle of neuroplasticity persisting throughout life, demonstrating that connections strengthen or fade according to usage. And this principle offers not only explanation but possibility, because pathways that quieted to disuse may rekindle through thoughtful challenge. Consider the effect of deliberate muscle activation beyond habitual gait, movements that require controlled shifts in weight, intentional recruitment of stabilizing musculature, or coordinated engagement between upper and lower body, and observe how these actions stimulate not only tissue contraction, but neural anticipation, forcing the brain to simulate outcomes, refine predictions, and update internal models of capability. Functional imaging studies consistently reveal that novel or complex movement patterns increase cortical engagement, showing that the brain remains curious when invited into unfamiliar territory, and curiosity at the neural level translates into resilience at the physical level. There is also an emotional dimension woven into this biological tapestry, because confidence and balance shapes willingness to interact with the world, influencing social participation, independence, and psychological well-being. And when neural signaling grows uncertain, the mind often interprets that uncertainty as vulnerability, retreating into smaller physical boundaries. Yet when stability improves, the emotional landscape expands correspondingly, illustrating the inseparability of physiology and perception. It becomes clear that strengthening balance is not merely an orthopedic or neurological objective, but a holistic reaffirmation of agency. What fascinates me most is how gentle these invitations to neural engagement can be, requiring not intensity but attentiveness, encouraging movements performed slowly enough for awareness to accompany action, allowing sensory feedback to register distinctly, reinforcing the brain's mapping of position and control. The act of pausing on one foot, the measured transition between seated and standing postures, or coordinated reaching tasks activate networks that integrate vestibular input, visual reference, and proprioceptive reporting, effectively rehearsing scenarios that everyday unpredictability might present. These rehearsals are not theatrical displays of strength. They are dialogues between perception and execution, cultivating readiness through rehearsal of variability. Philosophically, this understanding reframes aging from an inevitable narrowing into a negotiable transformation shaped by interaction, suggesting that the nervous system does not simply diminish, but adapts according to perceived necessity, and necessity itself can be redefined through intentional behavior. When individuals engage in movements that invite attention, concentration, and subtle challenge, they reaffirm their relevance to their own biology, reminding the brain that adaptability remains valuable, and the resulting neural investment manifests not only in steadier posture, but in renewed trust between mind and body. There is a quiet dignity in recognizing that equilibrium is not merely physical but relational, emerging from cooperation among sensory systems, motor responses, and conscious intention, and that cooperation thrives on dialogue rather than monotony. Walking continues to hold value as foundation, yet foundation alone does not build architecture, and through diversified activation the neural landscape becomes textured, responsive, and alert once more, illustrating that vitality often lies not in intensity of effort, but in richness of engagement, and that the body's communication networks remain receptive listeners long after society assumes their withdrawal, ready to strengthen their signals when movement evolves from habit into exploration. There's a tendency to think of joints and connective tissues as passive hinges in the architecture of the body, mechanical intersections whose only purpose is to permit motion, yet when we observe them with patient curiosity, we begin to recognize something far more intricate unfolding within their quiet structures. Ligaments hold memory of strain. Tendons translate intention into force. Cartilage distributes pressure like a thoughtful mediator, and the fascia that threads throughout the body behaves less like wrapping and more like a responsive communication web. After 75 years of living, these tissues have negotiated decades of adaptation, adjusting to patterns of use, compensating for imbalance, and preserving function even when challenged by time, and what they require is not simply motion but conversation, an exchange of forces varied enough to remind them of their elastic intelligence. Walking provides a gentle oscillation of load, encouraging lubrication within joint capsules and maintaining circulation through surrounding tissues. Yet it rarely stretches a dialogue beyond familiar boundaries, and familiarity, though comforting, can gradually narrow adaptability. Connective tissue thrives on variability, on subtle elongation followed by controlled contraction, on angles that invite fibers to reorganize themselves according to demand, and when these invitations diminish, the tissue responds by favoring efficiency over versatility, increasing stiffness not as deterioration, but as protective recalibration. Stiffness, however, alters biomechanics, redistributing forces across joints in ways that may amplify where in unexpected places, and thus the absence of diversified engagement can quietly reshape the experience of movement itself. Within tendons, microscopic collagen fibers align along lines of tension, reinforcing pathways where force is consistently applied, and when general resistance or mobility work introduces new directional demands, these fibers reorganize, enhancing tensile resilience, an illustration of how structural integrity is not fixed, but negotiated through experience. Similarly, cartilage absorbs nutrients through compression cycles, and varied pressure patterns encourage diffusion across its matrix, supporting cellular maintenance in tissues that lack direct vascular supply, suggesting that intentional mobility is less an optional accessory and more a fundamental nourishment mechanism for joint vitality. Scientific observation often reveals that even modest resistance, applied attentively and progressively, stimulates biochemical signaling within connective tissue cells, prompting synthesis of supportive proteins and recalibration of extracellular matrix composition, and these molecular events accumulate gradually into functional improvement. It is not spectacle that transforms tissue. It is consistency paired with mindful challenge, and this realization invites humility because it reminds us that biological change often emerges from quiet repetition rather than dramatic exertion. Gentle loading through controlled movements encourages coordination between muscle contraction and connective elasticity, distributing mechanical stress harmoniously rather than concentrated abruptly. Emotionally, The experience of rediscovering joint freedom carries significance beyond physiology because comfort and movement influences identity, shaping how individuals perceive their autonomy, their willingness to explore space, and their trust in their own embodiment. When joints feel restricted, the mind often adopts caution as default posture, narrowing engagement with the world. Yet when mobility returns, curiosity often follows, expanding emotional landscapes alongside physical range. This interplay between structure and perception underscores how intimately physical state intertwines with psychological openness, suggesting that caring for connective tissues is simultaneously an act of preserving dignity. From a philosophical perspective, there is beauty in recognizing connective tissues as storytellers of lived experience, each adaptation reflecting moments of effort, rest, strain, and recovery. And by introducing new forms of engagement, we do not erase history, but add chapters, demonstrating respect for what the body has endured while inviting it toward continued evolution. Mobility work and resistance are thus not corrections imposed upon decline, but collaborations with resilience, acknowledging that adaptability persists even when pace slows. Observing individuals who engage in deliberate joint-focused movement often reveals subtle transformations. Posture aligns with greater ease, transitions between positions become fluid, and energy once spent resisting stiffness becomes available for expression, illustrating that efficiency in movement is less about force and more about harmony among interacting tissues. Harmony arises when muscles, tendons, and joints coordinate seamlessly, distributing responsibility across systems rather than isolating burden. And this coordination reflects neural refinement as much as mechanical adaptation, reinforcing the interconnectedness of bodily processes. The fascination deepens when considering fascia, whose continuity across regions suggests that localized motion influences distant response, revealing the body not as segmented machinery, but as integrated fabric. And when stretching or strengthening occurs, signals propagate through this fabric, altering tension landscapes beyond immediate perception. This integrated responsiveness highlights the inadequacy of viewing exercise solely through localized outcomes, encouraging appreciation of systemic transformation unfolding across interconnected pathways. Ultimately, what emerges from exploring connective tissue resilience is an understanding that strength and suppleness are complementary rather than opposing qualities, each enhancing the other when cultivated thoughtfully, and that deliberate engagement with joints through varied motion fosters not only durability but awareness, nurturing attentiveness to sensation and alignment. In this attentiveness lies an almost meditative quality, where movement becomes exploration rather than obligation, allowing individuals to witness their own adaptability in real time. And within that witnessing arises a quiet reassurance that even after decades of adaptation, the body remains willing to respond, reorganize, and participate in dialogue shaped by curiosity and care. There is a moment that often goes unnoticed when the body begins to regain strength, a quiet shift not only in tissue and posture, but in the emotional atmosphere within which a person exists. And it is here that physiology and psychology reveal themselves as inseparable companions. Movement is never purely mechanical. It is interpreted by the mind, evaluated against memory, compared with expectation, and woven into identity. When an individual in later life rediscovers functional strength, the ability to rise without hesitation, to stabilize without fear, to engage with space confidently, something deeper than muscle activation occurs. The brain interprets capability as safety, and safety transforms emotional tone, allowing curiosity to replace caution, and engagement to replace withdrawal. Neuroscience has long demonstrated that physical activity influences neurotransmitter dynamics, altering concentrations of chemical messengers associated with mood regulation, attention, and motivation. And this influence becomes particularly meaningful in advanced age when emotional resilience may face subtle erosion through isolation or diminished sensory novelty. When muscles contract under purposeful challenge, signals cascade through endocrine pathways, releasing compounds that interact with neural networks governing perception of well-being, illustrating that strength is not merely structural but experiential. The act of coordinated effort communicates to the brain that the organism remains capable of adaptation, and this communication can reshape self-perception more profoundly than verbal reassurance. There is also an intricate relationship between posture and emotion, often underestimated because its mechanisms are quiet and gradual. Yet when strength supports upright alignment, the sensory feedback from joints and muscles alters cortical processing associated with confidence and vigilance. A stable stance reduces the subconscious need for protective monitoring, freeing cognitive resources for exploration and creativity. And individuals frequently describe this transformation not in technical terms, but as feeling lighter, more open, more willing to participate in life beyond routine boundaries. Scientific curiosity invites us to recognize these descriptions as reflections of measurable physiological shifts rather than poetic exaggerations. Memory plays its role in this transformation as well, because the nervous system records experiences of instability or limitation, shaping future expectations. And when new experiences of competence accumulate, they gradually overwrite anticipatory anxiety, encouraging the mind to predict success rather than threat. This recalibration influences decision-making, promoting activity participation, social interaction, and intellectual engagement, thereby reinforcing health through behavioral pathways that extend far beyond exercise sessions themselves. One begins to see how functional strength serves as catalyst, initiating cascades that influence lifestyle choices and relational dynamics. Philosophically, this invites reflection on the meaning of independence, not as isolated self-sufficiency, but as harmonious relationship with one's own capabilities. And when those capabilities expand, perception of possibility expands accordingly. There is compassion in acknowledging how easily limitation can narrow one's experiential horizon, and equally there is inspiration in observing how incremental improvement can reopen that horizon, revealing landscapes once assumed inaccessible. Functional strength thus becomes narrative transformation, allowing individuals to revise the story they tell themselves about aging, agency, and relevance. Scientific observation also highlights the reciprocal influence between cognition and movement, showing that tasks requiring coordination stimulate neural regions associated with executive function and memory consolidation, suggesting that regaining physical competence may simultaneously preserve mental sharpness. This reciprocity emphasizes a holistic nature of adaptation, where strengthening muscles indirectly nourishes cognition and mental clarity, in turn refines motor execution, forming a feedback loop that supports overall vitality. Within this loop, emotional affirmation reinforces participation, sustaining momentum toward continued engagement. The communal dimension cannot be overlooked, because improved mobility often invites renewed social presence, and human beings are profoundly responsive to connection, deriving emotional stability and cognitive stimulation from interaction. When individuals feel physically capable, they are more inclined to occupy shared spaces, exchange experiences, and contribute to collective life, illustrating that strengthening the body may indirectly strengthen community bonds. This perspective broadens our understanding of health from individual maintenance to relational enrichment. Observing such transformations evokes humility, reminding us that human well-being cannot be compartmentalized into separate domains of biology and meaning, because they are expressions of a single integrated process. The muscles that contract during purposeful effort are part of the same organism that dreams, remembers, and empathizes, and nurturing one aspect inevitably influences the others. Functional strength, therefore, becomes a bridge linking cellular processes with existential experience, grounding abstract identity in tangible capability. Within this realization lies an invitation to approach movement not merely as prescription, but as dialogue with self-perception, an opportunity to reaffirm presence within one's own body and environment, recognizing that dignity often flourishes where competence is nurtured. Each intentional motion carries symbolic resonance, representing participation in one's own continuation, and through repeated engagement, individuals may rediscover trust in their capacity to adapt despite chronological progression. This rediscovery is neither dramatic nor instantaneous. It unfolds gradually through accumulating moments of success that reshape emotional landscapes and cognitive expectations, revealing that resilience is not simply retained from youth, but continually cultivated through relationship between effort, awareness, and compassion toward one's own evolving humanity. There is a quiet but profound shift that occurs when we stop viewing aging as erosion and begin to recognize it as adaptation, a reorganization of priorities, rather than a subtraction of potential. Biology does not operate with nostalgia. It responds to current conditions, present demands, and ongoing dialogue, and the human body, even after 75 years, remains deeply committed to this principle. What changes with age is not the capacity to adapt, but the margin for inefficiency, the tolerance for neglect, and the consequences of misunderstanding what the body is asking for. When movement becomes deliberate rather than habitual, when effort becomes intentional rather than assumed, aging reveals itself not as a collapse, but as a refinement. From a scientific perspective, every system within the body is engaged in continuous negotiation, balancing energy conservation with functional necessity. Muscles adapt to what they are asked to do. Bones remodel according to stress signals they receive. Neural networks prioritize pathways that prove useful, and connective tissues organize themselves around patterns of demand. None of these systems operate on timelines defined by calendars. They respond to information, and movement is one of the most powerful forms of information the body receives. When that information becomes narrow, predictable, and undemanding, the body responds by streamlining itself for efficiency, not resilience. When information becomes varied, intentional, and meaningful, adaptation follows, regardless of age. This understanding invites us to reconsider the language we use around decline, because much of what is labeled as inevitable loss is often unchallenged adaptation to reduce demand. The body does not mourn lost strength. It reallocates resources away from what appears unnecessary. In this way, aging is not passive deterioration, but active decision-making at a cellular level, and those decisions can be influenced. When individuals engage in movements that require coordination, stability, and controlled strength, they signal relevance to systems that might otherwise downregulate, reminding the body that these capabilities remain valuable for survival and participation. There is also a philosophical humility in recognizing that the body is not failing us when it weakens, but responding accurately to the instructions it has been given. If the instruction is repetition without challenge, the response is maintenance without growth. If the instruction is caution without exploration, the response is protection without confidence. This reframing replaces blame with responsibility, not as burden but as opportunity, because it restores agency to the present moment. Aging becomes less about what has been lost and more about what is being communicated now. The concept of adaptation also extends beyond physical systems into identity itself. When individuals internalize the belief that aging equals fragility, behavior follows belief, and reduced engagement becomes both cause and consequence of decline. Conversely, when movement reintroduces challenge in controlled, compassionate way, belief shifts alongside capability. The body demonstrates competence, the mind updates expectation, and behavior expands accordingly. This feedback loop illustrates how deeply intertwined physical action and self-concept truly are, and how movement can serve as a medium through which identity is renegotiated. Scientific inquiry supports this integration, showing that purposeful physical engagement influences gene expression related to inflammation, repair, and metabolic efficiency, suggesting that adaptation operates even at the molecular level. These changes do not erase age-related processes, but they modulate them, shaping how aging is experienced rather than whether it occurs. This distinction is critical because it moves the conversation away from unrealistic ideals of reversal and toward realistic goals of optimization, dignity, and sustained participation in life. There is something profoundly human in this approach because it honors time rather than resisting it. It acknowledges that the body carries history in its tissues, yet remains open to new information, and that honoring aging does not mean surrendering curiosity. When movement becomes a form of inquiry rather than obligation, individuals engage with their bodies not as failing machines, but as evolving systems worthy of attention. Each controlled effort becomes an experiment, each improvement a data point reinforcing the idea that responsiveness remains intact. This perspective also reshapes how we measure success. Success is no longer defined by intensity, speed, or external comparison, but by clarity of communication between intention and response. It is measured in smoother transitions, steadier balance, reduced hesitation, and a quiet confidence that emerges when the body and mind trust each other again. These outcomes may not be dramatic, but they are transformative because they restore continuity between desire and action. Ultimately, reframing aging as adaptation invites compassion, both toward oneself and toward others navigating similar transitions. It encourages patience, not as resignation, but as respect for biological process. It replaces fear with curiosity and replaces passivity with participation. The body does not ask to be preserved as it once was. It asks to be engaged as it is now. And when that engagement is offered thoughtfully, deliberately, and consistently, aging reveals itself not as an ending, but as an ongoing dialogue between time, intention, and the remarkable intelligence that continues to reside within the human form.